fine, Richard. You win. The mustache is gone. Hello, ladies
Good.
and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. What a show we have ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine peace deal, the ANC's balance of forces theory, South Africa's economic outlook, the UK's new budget. We're going to be giving some Thanksgiving reflections. We'll be talking about Bheki in America and Mamdani in the White House. But before we get to any of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he is busily founding the London Met Police, the director of the Bremen Research Democracy Group, the Robert Peel of Potsdam, James Myberg. Advocating for Irish Home Rule, we have our UK correspondent, the William Gladstone of Golders Green, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Granting rights to minors in America, Washington, the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the Benjamin Disraeli of DC, Richard Tren. Vowing to never surrender to the Germans, we have the Common Sense's economics editor, the Winston Churchill of Beverly Hills, Becky Maflobo. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, naughtily running through fields of wheat, the Theresa May of Tamboerskloof, Gabriel Makin. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, we've got a jam-packed show today, and we're going to go straight to you, Richard, because you're going to be telling us giving us a little bit of context as to this new Russia-Ukraine peace deal and some broader context about the conflict generally. So, over to you, Richard.
Yeah, and I'm reluctant to talk too much about it because by the time this comes out, things might have changed. We might have a peace agreement. Things might have got worse. So who knows where this is going? But we could sort of pause to reflect what's happened over the last few days. So we had this 28-point plan that was released by the White House, and Trump, in his usual style, gave Zelensky until tomorrow, which is Thanksgiving here, to agree to it. And it was clear from the start that this 28-point plan was written by the Russians. This was a plan literally written by the Russians, and contained all sorts of provisions that Ukrainians could never agree to, such as giving land to Russia that it doesn't currently occupy, limiting Ukrainian troops to 600,000, and language there about Nazism in Ukraine. So this is stuff that they could never agree to. It was interesting to see the kind of politics of this. So the Secretary of State Marco Rubio mentioned to his former colleagues, he was a former senator from Florida, mentioned to his former colleagues that this was literally written by Russia. And they then leaked that. And then Rubio kind of walked it back and saying, oh, I never said that. But it'd be interesting to know maybe in time what was actually going on there. Maybe what you're getting here is Rubio trying to distance himself a bit from the plan, and at the same time, you had J.D. Vance, the vice president, really coming out and saying, well, actually, we shouldn't be doing anything for Russia, lamenting any support, for Ukraine, and lamenting the support that we've given to Ukraine already, and sort of getting back to his America. I'm not even going to say this is America first. This is kind of America withdrawn, America alone. And Vance's point being that we should be spending that money here at home. I don't know what's going on there. That's not a credible position. Vance really doesn't, if you read his book, he doesn't really think that spending more money on welfare at home is what lifts people out of poverty. That goes against everything he wrote in Hillbilly Elegy. So I think what you're seeing on one level is the sort of the jockeying for positions of the future of the Republican Party, and how how muscular our foreign policy should be post Trump. It seems like the attitude from the White House was to try and recreate the peace plan that Trump got achieved with Gaza and Israel. But this is very different. That was a plan that punished the aggressors. You don't reward aggressors, and this is a plan, the 28-point plan, that rewards the aggressors. Russia is the aggressor here. Let's not forget that. We now have the 19-point plan, which is much more acceptable to the Ukrainians, but probably not acceptable to Russia. So who knows where we stand? I will just make a couple of points before going to Simon and whoever else, people who are more learned than I. I think what we know on this is that Russia lies. I'm sorry for the Russophiles out there, but going back to 1994 with the Budapest Agreement, and then 97, 2003, 2010, 2014, these are just the agreements that Russia signed with Ukraine, and every single one of them they broke. Russia lies. Let's be clear about this. Whatever agreement does come out of this, I think we can expect Russia to break it and to keep being the aggressor. I do not share our other colleagues' fondness for for Russia in this fight. One last point. What's the point? I think we need to be clear-eyed about Russia, see it for what it is, a bad actor. Maybe China is the real solution here, putting secondary sanctions on China, limiting the access that Russia has to income from its sale of oil, and Russia's clearly getting support from China. One last point, what this means for longer term and for the future. Remember that I think the security guarantees that the West, that the United States and Europe give to Ukraine are critically important. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in return for security guarantees. If we renege on that, does it not make the world a lot more dangerous, a lot of countries less inclined to give up nuclear weapons, and more countries inclined to develop nuclear weapons because of the knowledge that actors like the United States will not be there to protect them from the bad actors like Russia and China? That's my however many minutes that was, little take on this.
So, Richard, before we extend it open to a little bit more people, you hinted at one of our colleagues' fondness towards Russia. I'll be a little bit more explicit. We're missing him today. France is usually a little bit more forgiving than, let's say, the average Western analyst as to the Russian position, and so I'm going to try my best to pick up his toxic football and run with it a little bit. Because something should be said that it 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 seems pretty unrealistic to think that it's not going to, whatever peace deal comes out, it's not going to be it has to be pretty painful for the Ukrainians. And the yes, that the kind of giving up of more territory than the Russians have already won, and there are a number of different provisions within the peace deal that are problematic. But what how should one, maybe, in as best you can answer this question, how should one try to separate out what is a necessary forfeit in order to you know achieve the kind of the peace, and what is something that's going a kind of forfeiture that's going to encourage more Russian advances and is going to be seen as a sign of weakness that puts Russia into a better position and just continues to see Ukraine ceding more and more of its territory over time?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that Ukraine will probably have to give up some of its territories. I mean, that's just reality. That's what happens when you live next to a big bully. It's not pleasant, but that's the world that you live in. I don't really know. I think what you don't do is you allow Russia to dictate the size of the Ukrainian army. You make it very clear. You don't offer, for instance, Russia to get back into the G8 and to become a normal to sit down at the table with normal democracies. This is a country where if you disagree with Putin, you get shoved out of a window or you get murdered in a prison in Siberia. I don't think we should be rewarding Russia with those kinds of incentives. I think we should continue to make it, to isolate it, to sanction it until And if you don't, then you don't want to be an Estonian or a Pole or a Lithuanian. Uh, I don't agree with the idea that Russia launched this war because of expansion of NATO. I think Russia launched this war because it laments the loss of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire and it wants to rebuild it. I think it goes back to that. I think I look, this is way above my pay grade. I don't know what you do, but I know that you don't reward bad actors, and I'm much more comfortable continuing to arm the Ukrainians, help them develop, like the Danish are doing. The Danish are helping the Ukrainians in building, I think, their drones and other missiles. Do that kind of thing, and respond forcefully when Russia does things like invading the airspace of EU countries and messing with their air um, radar, whatever they were doing there.
Simon?
Just a point on Richard's remarks there. Look, I'm not a negotiator's ass, but I do know that if you are negotiating with an administration and you've got a point man who's technically the equivalent of your position in him speaking to the president as you speak to your president. The one thing you don't do is you don't tell that guy what to tell his president or how his president should be phrasing stuff. And that's been leaked by Steve Witkoff, not by him, but about his negotiations there. So, all of this excitement has to be tempered, firstly by the realities that face this situation in terms of trade-offs and impossible trade-offs. And then they also have to be tempered by the propensity of cock-ups, which is and this incident with Steve Witkoff and his opposite number is a cock-up. And I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Richard, before. He's one of these New York real estate theater billionaires. He is very close to Trump. His children have some crypto arrangement with Trump's children that they are going around and doing. It doesn't sound very reassuring. I'm not exactly sure what it is. Mid-level marketing, whatever you call it, Amway for crypto. But I'm not. I'd like to know what you think about Steve Witkoff.
Well, I mean, yeah, he's a real estate developer, and people have been kind of scratching their heads about how he got there. I think that kind of relationship maybe works in the Gulf, where sending your son-in-law and your good buddy to negotiate with Gulf kingdoms where that kind of society, where that's kind of valued, where we're sending the son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who also close with Witkoff, is seen as a good negotiating ploy. This is someone who's close to the president, and you might find the same. Some Gulf sheikh might send his son-in-law. That's kind of works there. I don't think it works in other positions. Witkoff did do the right thing with Israel and Gaza, but that was also helped by the fact that Israel was bombing Qatar and telling them, showing them who was boss. This is a very different situation, and it doesn't seem to be a sort of to be able to repay this in some way, in the same way. This guy Kirill Dmitriev, who was the Russian who was negotiating all this, it seems like there are business links there. This is all kind of murky, and the Trump children's, as well as I don't know about Witkoff's involvement with cryptocurrency, but the Trump children's crypto businesses, it's all just a little bit sordid and makes you one question the motivations of what's going on. So this has me a lot less bullish about the prospects for peace and the United States, this making the world a safer place. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, you've also got the problem, it seems, though, that now that the United States is not particularly interested in continuing the war effort or continuing to supply Ukraine to the gills, that Europe can't really substitute out for the United States, and you are running out of men to, recruit and send to the front lines if you're Ukraine. So you're kind of being squeezed on all sides in terms of the resources you can bring to bear to continue the fight. Which means that, do you take the bad deal now, kind of in try to make it as good as you possibly can, maybe negotiate your way into a slightly better deal, or do you wait 6 months and see what happens if you risk, every month you continue to let this kind of war extend out, though it looks more and more likely like you might just have a kind of final Ukrainian collapse and a full-scale Russian victory.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, we also have to take into account Ukrainian politics. I mean, Zelensky also has his own constituency to deal with. He's under pressure himself. He also has a lot of Ukrainians who don't want to give up the fight, who are damned if they're going to just roll over and let Russia Russia win this. I mean, I have some Ukrainian friends. I have some other friends from Poland, from the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, and the one common thing all these people have is a deep and abiding loathing of Russia. They've lived with the threat of Russia. They loathe them and they don't want to give up. So we can talk all we like. If the Ukrainians want to keep on fighting, they're going to keep on fighting, and there won't be peace. And there might be, maybe it'll end in more deaths, but that's a horrible world that we live in.
Yeah. Although, as the ladies and gentlemen will find out later, it's not all bad. And so I'm
No.
going to move to a story, though, that kind of links a little bit to the Russian story, in the sense that we're going to be talking about the ANC's ideology, and it's an ideology that was honed by the previous Russian regime, the USSR. And James, you're going to be talking us through kind of what are these guiding principles? How does the ANC see the world, and how do they kind of make decisions about the movement?
To begin with, we sort of know that the ANC is capable of sort of pursuing moderate and radical approaches. So even within this year, we had this radical lurch at the start of this year when Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act into law. And now we seem to be in this moderate phase, and sort of the ANC is, from a Western perspective, good as gold. The sort of when it comes to attacks on farms, these are probably lower than they've ever been under the ANC. So it's how do you how does the ANC approach things is the question, and how should Western governments engage with the ANC? And obviously, Trump has come under huge criticism everywhere for his approach. But the point I want to return to at the end is what effect this has actually had on the ANC's conduct this year. Now, if you go and read the ANC's strategy and foreign policy papers over sort of 3 decades, you'll invariably see that there's a discussion of what is called the balance of forces. And where does this stand at this moment, and what does this allow, and what does it disallow? And now, to understand this concept, it originates in Marxist-Leninist ideology, in which the ANC has obviously been, saturated for several decades now. And essentially, the concept can be summarized as follows: for the ANC, its ultimate ends, which are the goals of the National Democratic Revolution, which is another old communist concept, are absolutely sacrosanct. And if you go back in history, these were originally laid out by the South African Communist Party in 1962. And the ANC has basically been committed to their realization ever since, although it formally signed them into sort of its ideology in 1969. And the NDR is an attempt to remedy the evils of what it calls colonialism of a special type, which is an application of Lenin's theory of imperialism to the South African situation. So when it comes to these goals, the ANC is totally, it's sort of, they're non-negotiable. The ANC is totally committed to them, and saying that they might be harmful or counterproductive or destructive just is totally, it will never penetrate. And to the extent that an ANC leader actually conceded the point, then he would be immediately regarded as a sellout, and he would lose his standing within the movement. So you can't really move on that, even if
Sorry,
as an ANC,
James.
yeah.
What are these goals that you're talking about that are sacrosanct, kind of the national democratic revolutionary goals?
Well, the basic theory of colonialism of a special type is that the predicament of the African majority was the result of the penetration of South Africa by the essentially European conquerors, who then stole all the wealth, hoarded all the wealth for themselves, and became wealthy at the expense of the land and the wealth of the black majority. And then the National Democratic Revolution is about transferring that wealth and power back to the black majority and achieving the ultimate of a situation of sort of equality of outcomes in all spheres of existence, from employment to land ownership to wealth, everything. So that's where the idea of demographic representativity comes from, that you must have pure race proportionality. So that's basically where those goals are. That's a very, very short summary of the idea.
Thank you.
So you have the situation where the ANC is totally unbending in its commitment to these ultimate goals, but then it has this tremendous flexibility when it comes to the pursuit of these goals. And here, in terms of the theory of the balance of forces, all methods are, attacks and retreats, the shift from one method of struggle to another, whether you escalate or whether you de-escalate, it's all sort of permitted. And the right tactics in these situations are determined essentially by what the balance of forces are. And the correct line or policy is determined by this sort of very careful calculation of these the different forces in society. And here, any deviation from what you judge to be the correct line is regarded as unpardonable. Now, it can imperil the revolution in two ways. One is by setting it back, or the other, or by defeating its advance. And these deviations from the correct line, which is this Leninist idea, can take two forms. Now, the one form is what's called left-wing adventurism, where you underestimate the hostile forces. So if you, for instance, try and seize power too early and then the Communist Party gets crushed, that would be seen as totally crushed by the state. That would be seen as left-wing adventurism.
Mm.
And then on the other side, there's what is called right-wing opportunism, which is where you overestimate the hostile, the forces arranged against you. And therefore, you're in a position to advance towards, your revolutionary goals, but then you fail to sort of push the advantage. So essentially, then the sort of two sins that liberation movements faces are, on the one hand, recklessly sort of progressing in the face of an adverse balance of forces, and on the other side, not pushing forward when the balance of forces in fact is in fact in your favor. So what you have is an ANC which is very is totally irrational and unreasonable when it comes to its ultimate ends. But on the other hand, can be very realistic and cautious when it comes to the pursuit of them, but only if it thinks that the balance of forces arrayed against it are adverse to the ANC. So what you've seen this year is the ANC pursuing quite a moderate stance over the last few months. And the question is, if you notice what's happened, it's no longer trying to rename Santon Drive after Leila Khalid. It is also not. It also at a certain point earlier this year, it stopped releasing press statements on a daily, sort of weekly basis, accusing Israel of genocide. It hasn't sought to operationalize the Expropriation Act to seize, white-owned farms or anything like that. At the same time, in its negotiations with the Americans, it refused to tie its hands in any way with regards to the pursuit of its long-term goals. So, in a sense, what one has to realize is that the reason the ANC has backed down, in a sense, is because in what I suspect has happened is the Trump administration put serious pressure on the ANC. And everyone's very critical of Trump for doing that. But in fact, that has probably led to the ANC, both in foreign policy and domestic policy, actually moderating its position for the moment. But what will happen if that pressure then gets taken off, as for instance the Western Europeans would like it to happen, then you'll see the ANC wanting to push forward again, because then the balance of forces will be in its favor. So that's basically a summary of the theory and how it's applying in South Africa at the moment.
Richard?
Yeah, so there's that saying, science advances one funeral at a time. Is this outlook throughout the ANC sort of young and old, or is this still the old guard that maybe got their education at the Lenin International School? Are there younger ANC people coming up that understand, that have maybe a more classical liberal approach to the world, or is this sort of filtered down and re-indoctrinated with every new generation?
I'm not sure how many young, the young people, the Youth League broke away to form the EFF, and those guys are even more extreme on this stuff.
Okay.
So,
Right.
so I'm really not sure, but it is a sort of useful way of also, it's a sort of useful way of looking at assessing political questions, even if you're not a communist. What is the balance of forces, and I suspect it would help, negotiations with the Russians if you understood that theory as well in relation to the Ukraine, because the Russians would have been trained in that, as were the Chinese, so they understand perfectly well how this theory works. Westerners tend not to, so they tend to sort of try and placate the ANC, and then the ANC see that, and then they say, we can push forward even more aggressively. So you had a Biden administration that was endlessly sort of trying to placate the ANC, and the ANC in that situation became more and more extreme. And then you had Trump coming along and in his sort of wild way taking on the ANC, and then you saw the ANC in fact actually moderating its foreign policy quite drastically.
James, I've got a question. What do you kind of couple of things to put to you, and then a question based on them. So, I had a conversation with Ashur Sarupin a couple of weeks ago, who's the deputy finance minister from the DA, and one of the points that he made during that conversation was that actually there are substantive policy reforms happening. They're not, they're not massive sweeping changes like the wholesale privatization or stuff like that. But for example, there have been 11 private licenses given to operate on Transnet lines. You've got the unbundling of Eskom is continuing to tick over and is slowly going to happen. There's been some concessioning of the port in it was either Richards Bay or Durban. And so there seems to be like actual movement towards reform especially under this new kind of GNU arrangement. But in a conversation we've had on Makin Sense earlier, you mentioned how the reform moment in a political party can oftentimes be the most dangerous, right? So one, I guess my question is twofold. One, do you think that, we should take these kind of reform measures that the ANC seems to be implementing currently as signs of actual kind of change in policy direction, like an actual moderation, or is it just more of a kind of take a step back so we can bide our to give ourselves more time so that we can eventually start to press again? And then the second thing is, if the ANC is actually underway of the process of reform, might that not spell kind of the end of the movement as you laid out, as this reform moment can be so dangerous to the party, as it essentially cedes the intellectual territory to the DA by acknowledging your reforms are what's going to get us out of the trouble in South Africa?
Sure. Well, the way those reforms would be sold within the ANC is, look, comrades, we've run out of electricity, and the voters hate us because of that. Therefore, we have to adjust our tactics and bring in fix various things in ESCOM. And we can't get our coal out to export, so we're running out of money. So it could be it can be justified in terms of the theory. And Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki was quite brilliant, I think, at being able to persuade the party. Look, in terms of our ideology, we have to pursue a different path. So I don't think. I think the ANC is still committed to its goals. It's just shifted the methods by which it's pursuing them, and for very hard reasons. It's because, obviously, if you've literally running out of electricity, you actually have to find a different approach. But it took that hard reality for it to shift. In terms of it sort of hasn't backed down on any of the big stuff, and for as long as it wasn't getting pushback, like it was pursuing that stuff very, very aggressively earlier this year on the expropriation bill. It then released those race quotas, which were or are completely sort of insane. And it's sort of only with this very aggressive pushback that it sort of put those on pause. But I mean, the danger is as soon as those get, the pressure comes off, then they'll lurch forward with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is just and this kind of question, of them bringing inside the DA, would the goal be to would they want to co-opt the DA into the movement to like pursue the ends? What do you if you are a kind of ANC strategist now sitting having to have the opposition literally in as part of government with you, how do you deal with that given the kind of balance of forces theory, and also given that one of the things that's so fascinating about South Africa is despite the fact that it has a government that is steeped in, Marxist-Leninist ideology, it's got a very pragmatic, moderate, centrist kind of public opinion. And so you're seeing it's going to be very difficult for you to be more popular pursuing your agenda than your partner in government who are pursuing an agenda that's actually popular to the average South African.
Yeah, well, you see, they could have gone into coalition with the EFF and MK. But that would have, I mean, in terms of this theory, I mean, there are other realities, obviously, but I'm just explaining it in terms of the theory we're talking about, that would be seen as the left-wing adventurist approach. You would have ushered in a sort of collapse, an economic collapse and pain, and that then would have threatened your sort of long-term ability to give effect to the revolution. So when it comes to the DA, you go into coalition with the DA, and that sort of essentially buys you time. The DA was getting seriously pushed around earlier this year. I mean, it was being treated like a total doormat. And it's sort of only when Trump started, his crazy accusations, that suddenly the DA started being treated as a valued sort of partner. And the DA also had to take a tough stand on the budget, which I think helped shift things in their favor. Yeah. So I mean, the critical thing is if the DA was to seriously challenge it at the moment, the ANC has options. So it has the DA on one side, and that's a sort of safe option for the moment. It has the MK and EFF as alternative partners, but there's huge risks, left-wing adventurous risks for going into a coalition with them. The real question is what the ANC would do if the liberation movement was facing a sort of catastrophic total defeat. In which case, then you might go the sort of Mugabe option and try pull down, the whole society and the economy in the process, and finally give effect to the goals of the revolution. But for the moment, the ANC, it still has a path to achieving what it sees as its political goals, so it doesn't have to go crazy.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it. And we're going to leave South Africa for the moment to talk about a political party that has no clear idea of what its goals are, I think, and has no idea of how to achieve this lack of clear goals. And that is the Labour Party in the UK, who have decided to give us a really bad budget part two, because this is an improvement on how bad last year's budget was by making it even worse. And now, Simon, I hear that you were given access to Rachel Reeves' notes that she had written before the budget, before any of her speechwriters got to them. And you're going to be sharing with us what the budget speech she wanted to give was something like that.
To your point about, it is what it is. The budget was delivered 2 hours ago, about 2.5 hours ago in Parliament. The budget itself was leaked to the Office for Budget Responsibility, who then went and made the incredibly smart move of putting it up on their website. So if you were sitting on the trading floor and you had to hedge your positions, it was like getting the exam 2 weeks before you had to sit writing it. So there's a lot of congratulations going around because people are going to make money from this, but it's really quite pathetic. I have never seen anything like this in South Africa. I've never actually seen anything elsewhere in the world. When the guys in the Solomon Islands deliver their budget, they don't cock it up as badly. And they came and said, no, we are going to launch a thorough investigation. A crime may have been committed, a criminal offense may have gone down in this. And yeah, so I looked at that. I actually kind of, I knew that it was going to be very bad. I think everyone else knew it was going to be very bad. It's a benefit street budget, and all the worst metrics are flashing red: inflation, unemployment, cost of borrowing. It's all across the board bad. But it's good if you have a big family and you're on benefits. It's good if you like watching people be taxed for trying to save for their pension. The people who put extra money toward their pension are going to be taxed. That's cynical. But what I thought I'd do today is I thought I would. And Rachel Reeves lied. She lied out of her teeth in part. She kept on blaming the party seated opposite her because everything is their fault apparently. And I admit, and Richard supports me here, is that they didn't do a good job, the Conservatives. But in the year that Rachel Reeves has been in power, they have been horrendous. So what I thought I'd do is that I thought I'd become honest Rachel Reeves for the purpose of this exercise and deliver you a budget speech which, if she was telling the truth and what she really feels. So if you'll allow me to go ahead, it's right here. It's just a couple of pages. It won't take too much time.
Please,
But this is
please, Simon, before you start, let me call this house to order so that you may have a clear platform to deliver the speech.
Thank you. That was kind of you. That was most thoughtful. So this is basically like Rachel Reeves being honest. Okay. Mr. Speaker, by the way, I don't like that. Okay, I much preferred when Willie Madisha was in Parliament and you just heard Speaker, Speaker the whole time, and that was sort of away with the Oxbridge pleasantries. So, Mr. Speaker, my fellow parliamentarians who I join and in some cases lead as the most underperforming, worst value for money generation in the history of political elites, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the death spiral. Lol. Today, the tax burden I impose upon the middle classes, I do so for a few reasons. Firstly, because they're a bit odd. Like, why be so aspirational the whole time? Secondly, because I hate them, as most of you do, across all party lines. None of us want them as supporters because they are the ones who call the whole time and leave messages at our constituency offices like, there's a wall, there's a garden, there's a wall in my garden that is falling down. Just let it fall, peasant, and preferably lie underneath it before it does. Mr. Speaker, let me describe the mansion tax that I have today imposed. Some of the greatest thinkers in the history of the world, from Karl Marx to the Weather Underground in California, the Black Panthers, Shining Path in Peru, and indeed our dear friends in Mkhonto Wesizwe, have given us all the wisdom we need. You can't actually live in two houses. You only need one. But because you insist on two, or in some cases three, you're going to get the Black Panther treatment in taxes. These taxes will set forth in motion events that in years to come will eventually see the confiscation of these very houses. We will raise them, and in their place we will build memorials to George Floyd, puberty blocker cafes, net zero study resources, which will be powered by palm oil that was totally worth making orangutans extinct for. Mr. Speaker, we'll take all those taxes and we'll give them to people who also hate you, but aren't in government. And because there are more of them than there are of you, there's no prospect for loss for us. Those people will be kept in seed oils, Lucozade, processed turkey Twizzlers, giant chunks of yellow Gouda, and because I'm inclusive, chicken jalfrezi. And if you think this diet is sending them to an early grave, got news for you suckers. That money will also be spent on Ozempic, which, like everything else, they'll get for free thanks to you. I'm a woman. That doesn't mean I think that there are only two sexes, but you will submit before me. Recently, I was invited to a meeting of North Sea oil companies. A man in a suit, a man, had the temerity to ask why I was taxing North Sea oil companies so heavily. So I said to him, you will respect me. I am the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the first woman to be Chancellor. And as I told both the Times and the Financial Times of London, the reporters they sent me, by the way, just like my own team, 19-year-olds with gender study degrees, I am just sick of the mansplaining. Mr. Speaker, now, as I was saying, you're all FUCED. In the last few weeks, a number of leaks have occurred. This has been, by orders of magnitude, the leakiest of leaky budgets. And there's a reason for that. It was deliberate. You see, we consider these leaks as one feature of a wider demoralization campaign, one that involves the consistently hopeless Bank of England failing in its mandate to lasso inflation, or the Office for Budget Responsibility failing in its predictions of tax collection, or our decision to give away the nuclear-accommodating naval base of Diego Garcia, along with billions of cash to the government of Mauritius, or even our willingness to sit down with proponents of reparations who are asking for around £14 trillion. By the way, I've told them that they should be aiming for £25 trillion, and I'm determined, as a woman, to ensure that they get it. Growth is a stupid idea. Flatlining, on the other hand, is marvelous, but not as exciting as decline, which is where I'm taking the economy. Around the drain, off the cliff, out the window. Call it as you wish. Everything here is fair game, and by the time I'm done, you'll ask yourself, what was I thinking? Saving, paying my taxes, volunteering, donating, possessed by vigor for risk, with the goal of building real wealth. Very, very irresponsible. Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to the great women who have gone before me. Valerie Solanas, the artist and feminist icon, and don't come at me with the stuff about her trying to kill Andy Warhol, because you'll just sound like another one of these idiots trying to draw our attention away from billionaires to the Sudan, where nothing's wrong, by the way. Harriet Harman, the deputy leader of Labour, who once wrote a thoughtful letter urging us to go easy on the pedos, minor attracted persons. She was also ruthlessly attacked by the kind of people who owned 2 homes for declaring her love of Fidel Castro. Hillary Clinton and her beautiful daughter Chelsea, women who have never lied or stolen cutlery from the White House, bleached evidence at any point, and of course Greta Thunberg, who isn't filled with hatred, who is charming, mild-mannered, as you discover when you sit down with her at her family's 3rd home. This is the one by the lake in Sweden. Winnie Mandela, wow, my hero. In fact, I like Winnie more than anyone in the history of the world ever. When I was working in a bank, rather at the IT help desk in a bank's call center, I used to daydream about fighting alongside her. By then, she was dead. Whatever. Mr. Speaker, I'm just so inspired. One of the greatest philosophers in history, Meghan Markle, recently said, "You are strong," and I took that to mean me. Actually, she wrote it on a banana and gave it to a sex worker in Bristol. Well, I am strong, and today I have taxed every living organism in the United Kingdom. By this evening, there will not be an atom without a 100% VAT tag attached to it in the land. The taxes are as follows: gambling tax hike, milkshake tax, taxi tax, pay per mile EV tax, mansion tax, milkshake tax, tourist tax, and they're going to be even more. This is because multiculturalism, like recycling, is important. Mr. Speaker, I recently had the pleasure of meeting the Howatug family, formerly of Mogadishu, Somalia. They came as refugees, but 2 weeks later returned there for a holiday, something they frequently repeat, and I think that's just wonderful. They also reside in a 7-bedroom house in Hampstead. The council has very thoughtfully given them, and I'm delighted to tell you that their eldest son, Jamal, has recently been appointed the leader of something called an Al-Shabaab chapter. Jamal was educated in the state schooling system, which will receive even more of your taxes. If anyone doubts the model of youth mobility in this country, just look at young Jamal and the bright future that he is making for himself. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I announce new measures against inheritance, the continuation of the war against farmers, and taxes on bottled latte in supermarkets. This is one of these areas where people locate delusions of middle-class grandeur. I also announced 75% pay rises for all civil servants. These are the people dragged into select committee hearings and described as woke or useless or out of their depth by right-wing politicians. I'm also reducing the number of working days from sometimes 3 to even 2. Tuesdays are the new Mondays, and they can leave at 3 p.m. on Wednesdays. It would be remiss of me not to address a meeting that occurred on the fringes of South Africa's recent hosting of the G20. There, another man called Jonathan Oppenheimer, revealed that the roadworks required to turn an 18-mile stretch of land on the A66 from a single carriageway to a double carriageway will take 30 years. 30 years? How about never, Jonathan? How about watching the evolution of man's features in the guy holding up the red or the green flags as you wait to go? Mr. Speaker, we're in for a rough ride, a very dark, cold, uncomfortable hole from which it will be possible to escape. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I commend the speech to the House. If she'd been honest, she would have said that. There we go.
Thank you very much, Simon. I don't think there's too much more to talk about there, except maybe just on a kind of more serious note. You know, What do you think that this, like a kind of budget of this poor quality that shows no kind of actual effort to alleviate the problems that the British society is facing, do you think that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and this kind of the current government is going to last its full term, just given how they seem to stumble from blunder into blunder into blunder?
Well, the constitutional framework requires an election unless the ruling party calls an early one. What she has in her favor is this is a slow decay. It's not a rapid decay. When when you boost benefits like she has, it will invariably end up badly, but not immediately badly. And you can see the number of people leaving the country. Britain is now probably on the poorer side of a European nation. That can only happen if he calls an early election. If he calls an early election, then it's looking as though Reform will probably win at this point. But on the converse, what this has done is accelerated interest in far left politics, which you can see emerging by the Green Party and their economic plans, which are horrendous. Now, if what happens when left-wing governments get into power in the UK, they go right. Tony Blair did so between 1997 and 2007, and Gordon Brown after him for a few years, 3. What that does is it doesn't really affect the main opposition, but it really irritates the far left because they're of the view that this should be the party representing them, and they are not executing the mandate. Saying that, she's saved herself a little bit today because this benefits emphasis will result in taming some of the more vocal critics that she has she's aggravated over the past year. But the serious part of the factual part of what I read about that, those taxes aren't all of them. The milkshake, the paper mile, EV, the mansion, they're much more with that. And what happens now, Gabriel, is that you go through a sort of 2-month gnashing your teeth period of trying to understand how this affects you. But working people have today been given as I told Richard earlier, they've been given a bloody nose. And you have to ask the question, and for any South African listener out there, is that if you are planning to come to the UK, then think again. Go to Thailand, go somewhere else, because your money is going to become, you will be sucked out of it. So it's not the place to come to build wealth anymore. And I think that's not great. That's a sad feature.
Yeah. To Richard, then to James.
Yeah, some of us on this podcast are old enough to remember Britain in the 1970s, the late 1970s. In fact, I remember things were bad. Britain was called the sick man of Europe, the winter of discontent. This was before Margaret Thatcher came to power and actually started supply side reforms that generated growth. And growth is everything, as we know. I think the difference is that I'm not sure that we have a Margaret Thatcher in waiting in the wings, and there doesn't seem to be an appetite for growth there. As an aside, I remember on one trip, maybe it was 1978 or 77, flying back to Jan Smuts Airport as it was, and my older sister as we landed, and Britain was kind of crappy. There was rubbish everywhere. It was awful. It was depressing. And as we landed back at Jan Smuts, my older sister said, "Oh, thank God we're back in civilization." I mean, so this is what it's back to. Let's hope there is somewhere some return to growth, but maybe those years of growth and opportunity are an unusual blip in a downward trajectory for Britain, sadly.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say there, Rich, I've had to think what you said to me earlier, and I think you might be right, that maybe this was an illusion. This was an experiment that wasn't actually part of a national story or identity. And this maybe is a full-on left-wing country with the desire for the welfare state, like they have in places like Denmark. And that's the truth. And maybe we've been thinking that this is a global financial center has just run its course, and now nature must prevail as it relates to instinct. So, yeah.
James?
Is there any sign at all that they're willing to compromise on their net zero commitments, which are driving up their electricity prices and essentially killing the economy and starving themselves of tax revenue?
On the contrary, they are accelerating there. So it's not just a sober analysis of what this is happening with the most expensive energy in Europe per unit cost. At 30p, it's the most expensive. 32p, I think it is now. There's no, James. There's no consideration of that. It's, there's the I don't know what the analogy is, falling off the cliff or so on. There's the edge of the cliff. Let's accelerate. The net zero is just on top of these things. Okay, these are bad enough. I think you could stomach them if you had a fairer tax, if you didn't have such a progressive taxing model. But with a benefits country with the most expensive electricity is a recipe for disaster. Nobody can deny that, and I mean that's something that it's very basic. It's cause and effect. So yeah, no, there was renewable energy was quoted a number of times in her speech. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is a sad reflection that given we're now for more than 3 months into this kind of Makin Sense project, that we have been unable to find, and we tried, ladies and gentlemen, I promise you we tried. We're looking for the good in the United Kingdom, and this is yet a further example of the fact that the direction of travel is in that country is probably the worst of the ones that we focus on here at Making Sense. But of course, the country that we all care about the most is, in fact, our home of South Africa. And Becky, you're going to be taking us back there for this next story and telling us about some of its economic outlook. But first, before you get there, welcome Becky to the podcast. As a reminder to the ladies and gentlemen, he's the economics editor of the podcast, and he also makes up the other 50% of France Cronier private clients. So Becky, given that everything that Franz knows about economics you taught to him. Can you tell us about South Africa's economy, maybe a little about budget and the kind of the outlook going into the next year?
Hi, Gabriel. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to make my first appearance on Making Sense. I don't know how exactly to follow that up after Simon's reading of the speech there. It's quite remarkable, actually. I was just actually quite amazed. In terms of South Africa's 2026 economic outlook, there could be real signs of recovery in the country should we see a unity government cooperate on public policy in the country. A prime example of this is the complete opposite of what you're seeing in the UK. Take, for example, with South Africa's medium-term budget policy statement that was just said about 2 weeks ago. What you had there was a finance minister of the ANC and two deputy finance ministers, one from the ANC, another one from the DA. And what they accomplished under the National Treasury was to deliver a confidence medium-term budget policy statement. Usually this is just a normal update from the main budget that's said in February of this year. But this time they delivered something that's quite remarkable. The first thing that was said in that medium-term budget policy statement was that South Africa was running a consistent primary budget surplus. What that is the difference of government revenue being higher than non-interest spending by the South African government. That's been going on over the past 3 years, and they project that to continue, which is very important because it means that they're clamping down on expenditure. Another important point, which we thought was, and it's quite good for the country, is the consideration of a fiscal anchor, which would prevent future government from printing money in the country that would lead to hyperinflation. One of the most remarkable things that we continue to highlight about national treasury is that in a situation where definitely revenues have stagnated, government debt to GDP is that of about 80% as a proportion of GDP, but they plan to stabilize that below 80%, usually in some countries, in order to plug your deficit levels. South Africa's deficit level, now accounting for interest expenditure, sits at about negative 4.7%. which is multiple times higher than that of the growth level in the country. So you're spending more than what you're receiving in government revenue, and that's adding towards your debt levels. There's two ways you can solve that issue. One way is that you can massively raise taxes towards your citizens, or the other way, which would be the more disastrous way, is to weaken the independence of the South African Reserve Bank and massively print money in order to cause social frustration, as well as print your way out of a debt spiral situation. National Treasury chose not the latter. And even so, with tax increases, those have been moderate if you're looking at the bracket creep, as well as the pushback from the VAT hike, which happened earlier this year. We have a prudent National Treasury, one that I see from Kevin Simon's reading does not make the same mistakes that happened, that is happening in the UK. Even so, actually, one important point is that the current finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, saw he tabled a finance during 2021, which saw the shortest served prime minister in the UK. So even though we like to criticize South Africa, and rightfully so, there's a lot of positive things that we see in the country. One of that being of the National Treasury. Now, in terms of the hard numbers, when looking at business confidence and consumer confidence, the real numbers that will give us a gauge of South Africa's economic performance have not moved quite a dramatic amount that will see South Africa reach high levels of economic performance. A way we gauge the future prospects of the country is looking at confidence. Looking at business confidence, which you can think about this as the confidence of businesses to expand their operations. Those confidence points are about half of where they used to be in 2007. Confidence indicator ranges from 0 to 100. Closer you are to 100, the more confident you are. And currently, South Africa's business confidence is about half of where it was in 2007. And that period saw South Africa's high economic performance ranging about 5% per year consecutively from 2004 until 2007. Currently, they have declined. And if you look at the consumer confidence, which is a signal on consumption expenditure in the country, which accounts for about 60% of GDP, that is also lower than what it was in 2007. So what we're seeing here is that from a firm perspective, as well as that from a consumer perspective, they don't have much confidence over the long-term economic prospects of the country. Your business confidence indicator informs what may happen with fixed investment, which is the commitment by businesses, whether South African or foreign companies, investing their funds into South Africa in order to expand their operations. But given low confidence levels from business confidence perspective, we see fixed investment levels in the country remain where they currently are at about 15%. Now, this is very important because if you're to look at the long-term trends, we at France Cognier Private Clients, as well as the Common Sense, favor historical trends. Between 1994 and 2007, fixed investment as a proportion of GDP rose to reach a peak of about 22% as a proportion of GDP. That's quite remarkable because that's the same level that you see in emerging markets, which range at about 25 to 30%. And the consequence of that is a very clear relationship between the investment a country has as well as its economic performance. South Africa in that period, as I've mentioned before, recorded consecutive years of 5% GDP growth between 2004 and 2007, never seen before since 1960. But subsequent to that period, the country adopted policies that resulted in a tax on the commitment of investment to the country, resulting in fixed investment levels to decline to where they currently stand at about 15%. What that means for GDP growth is that we continue to expect GDP growth to be capped at about 1%. Our number for 2025 sits at about 0.8%. And for 2026, we expect it to be at about 1.6%. So moderate improvement, but that moderate improvement right there, which we can talk about as we sort of dive into this and give this more meat, is not as a consequence of massive policy advancements in the country, but rather the cumulative rate cuts that South Africa has seen by the South African Reserve Bank, which has been about 150 basis point cuts since September of 2024, which we think will lift retail spending as well as household consumption. So in terms of the hard numbers, the broader economic landscape remains that one of a GDP growth rate of about 1%. I see that Simon has his hand up here, or Gabriel, you can hop in here before
You preceded me there, Simon.
Just to Bheki, on the question of Liz Truss and her rapid departure from the government. We've spoken before on this, and we are not convinced that that was an entirely economic conundrum that she imposed. Some of us are of the view that she was the victim of sabotage, a cajole, cahoots between the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility. I'd like to talk to you at some point in more detail when I'm across in California about that, because I think you'll find what actually she was trying to do very interesting. And as it relates to South Africa, I think I've spoken to a few people reasonably aware, and they were of the view that she had the right idea, but it was just ordered in the wrong way. And
of course.
Growth were quite noble, actually.
Yeah, of course. I should thank you for that, Simon. I should add a clarification. I'm not against some of the policies that she was implementing or looking to go ahead with during the pandemic. What the comment that I was saying was, given the market's reaction to it and how it was done, exactly what you've mentioned there, it was not perceived well. And I think actually what she was trying to do, correct me if I'm mistaken, I mean, is that she was trying to clamp down on government expenditure, if I'm not mistaken there. And I think that's a good thing, because higher government expenditure is basically the government telling its citizens that it has more capabilities of spending money than its own citizens. But what I find remarkable about Enoch Godongwana is that in that period, he handled a budget under high market uncertainty. During that period and even now, delivered a budget that resulted in South Africa's credit upgrade. And we're looking that to be the case in the following two rating agencies by Fitch as well as that of Moody's. So this is quite a remarkable thing, and it's done by the unity government. This is actually one of the markers that should be said as the success of the unity government between that of the ANC and that of the DA. But in terms of the hard public policy proposals that the country needs to actually achieve to become a success, those have not moved the dial much. Gabriel, you mentioned there what the Deputy Finance Minister was mentioning in terms of railroad networks and port sessions. But what the country needs to do is plug that gap that you see with South Africa compared to that of its emerging markets. Emerging markets, just to recall that figure, is about 10 percentage points higher than that of South Africa, which sits at about 25% compared to South Africa at 15%. And their growth number is at about 4%. Go ahead there, Gabriel.
Yeah, so Bheki, that would, just to clarify there, you were talking about the fixed direct investment. Yeah, fixed investment levels. A comment that you kind of glossed over that maybe I'd like to linger on a little bit is that you called at the beginning of this year, you said that the South African growth rate in 2025 is going to be 0.8%. And you're one of the few people, economic analysts, who hasn't had to adjust your growth rate number throughout the year. So maybe take us through, like, briefly, how did you come to that like 0.8? How does one come to a kind of growth rate estimate? And then you mentioned that it was like kind of the coming off of the interest rates that sees you kind of have this increased estimate for next year. But can you explain also a little bit of the dynamic there? Why does like reduced interest rates lead to a kind of moderately higher growth number next year?
Yeah, that's very good. I'm just going to start with the initial projection that we had for February this year. That number we put it out for clients as well as for the public in February this year as well. So the number that you're referring to there, Gabriel, is 0.8% GDP growth for 2025. How we came to that conclusion of the growth rate in the country is largely looking at the fixed investment rate as a proportion of GDP. Look at this trend over the past 50 years, again, favor of historical trends in the country, is that whenever you see a period in which you see a high levels of fixed investment in the country, in other words, businesses committing to invest in South Africa, that leads to a subsequent increase in economic performance of the country. What informs the fixed investment level is business confidence, which at the time, if you're looking at the previous administration of the ANC, under that of Nelson Mandela as well as that of Thabo Mbeki, you saw business confidence in the country reach the highest level in a historical record of about 80 points in the first quarter of 2007, never achieved before. And that was done by the prudent and growth policies that you saw under Thabo Mbeki, which led to enormous amounts of improvement in the living conditions of ordinary South Africans. An example of this, which we like to quote as well, is the number of people employed doubled from 1994 until that of 2008, as well as that actually, which is also quite interesting, is that the unemployment rate, Thabo Mbeki's presidency was marked as a jobless growth era, which saw high levels of economic growth. But if you looked at the unemployment rate, it initially rose. But then that initial rise was largely due to the apartheid distortions, which withered out into the early 2000s. And what you saw there was an increase in the black participation rate because there were economic opportunities in the country. So people availed themselves for employment, leading to a higher unemployment number. But eventually that number declined under that of Thabo Mbeki, where it reached about 23 unemployment rate of 23%. Subsequent to that period, what the country saw was what James referred to as an advancement of the NDR policy of the ANC from that of 2008. And what we saw is that fixed investment, before I get to fixed investment, starting that with business confidence, it declined from its peak where it saw to where it sits at about half of where it is, as well as that of fixed investment declining quite massively to where it currently is at 15%. So those numbers, as well as policy at the time, and this was about February, we weren't seeing a dramatic move towards policy reforms in the country at that time. We still saw that of the movement towards expropriation law compensation, as well as that of the national health insurance. And if you can recall this time as well, tensions between the United States and South Africa was starting to intensify. And our read of this, even though we say that the US tariffs only shave a fraction of GDP percentage points of South Africa's economic performance, what we saw that was a lost opportunity of the South African government to attract vast amounts of capital commitment into the country, which led to a number of 0.8% GDP growth at that time, also foreseeing what might happen once the tariffs get implemented. For next, go ahead there, Gabriel. I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah. So just and then your basic argument then for the kind of why there's this increased growth rate is that essentially there's been almost no kind of necessary policy level change, which would generate like the mass amount of growth, the mass amount of fixed investment. But the fact of the matter is that decreased interest rates lead to increased consumer spending. So off a very low base, you can achieve what looks like quite a bit more considerable growth. But really, it's just a reflection of the fact that, as you say, since September 2024, interest rates are down 1.25%, 125 basis points.
Let's put this, like, for example, which is very good, into a household or business perspective, how they benefit from a cutting of interest rates. South African households have very high debt levels. South African debt as a proportion of disposable income sits at about 65%. which is quite higher than South Africa's early 2000 period, which was about 50%. So it has increased by quite about 10 percentage points, slightly more. What that means is that once you start to see the South African Reserve Bank cut interest rates, it means that for households that have mortgages, they suddenly servicing that mortgage becomes cheaper. For people that own cars, servicing your car becomes cheaper. And for people that are looking to take on credit, the banks look at them and they become worthy to actually take on more credits. So it becomes cheaper for households to service their debt. So they have that little bit of a gap to spend on other goods. And what's also interesting as well is that you have people that wouldn't have qualified for credit before qualify for credit. But this is very important though, because South Africa's employment number has really stagnated over the past decade. So you can only have a small proportion of people actually qualify for new credits. But even though those people do qualify, we do see that spending to essentially to materialize in retail spending as well as that of household consumption. From a business perspective, lower interest rates allows businesses to borrow at lower interest rates, which they use to expand their operations. This means that they hire slightly more people, but still, in order to drive that dial to high economic performance in the country, for GDP performance to surpass 2%, what you need is aggressive policies that would actually lead to South Africa becoming a successful nation. One point, actually, I'd like to touch on here is this could be easily done within the next 2 years, is looking at South Africa's energy outlook. Minister Ramakgopa, under his tenure, being leading and charging that of the electricity grid in South Africa, took South Africa's capacity. When you look at South Africa's electricity generation capacity, it's largely divided into about four indicators. The first one is the energy availability factor, which is the proportion of electricity generated by Eskom and sent to the South African economy. Another gauge is breakdowns, which is unplanned breakdowns on power utilities in South Africa. Another gauge is that of maintenance, which is actually the planned sort of shutting down of power plants in order to maintain them. And the other category is named as other, opposing to other means that would take away from grid capacity. Under his tenure, he took South Africa's energy availability factor from where it was in about 2023 at about 50%. Even in that year, it dipped to as low as 49%. And for South African households, they can recall this led to high levels of load shedding in the country. Stage 8, the country which has never seen before, about 200 days of load shedding in South Africa. Following the next 2 years, the energy minister took that energy availability factor, which was sitting at 50, and he increased it to about 60%. And that was as a result of an increase in electricity generation from coal in the country, which increased about 10 percentage points from where it was in 2023. Now, for South Africa to actually see those growth levels that we're talking about here, Gabriel, is that it needs to continue that trend even more aggressively. If you look at countries that have the relationship between electricity generation as well as GDP growth, particularly for an economy like South Africa, a 1% increase in electricity production leads to a 1% increase in GDP growth. So if you want to see about 2% 2% GDP growth rates in the country, you would need to increase electricity production by 2%. But the real mark that South Africa should be aiming for is about 4 to 5% GDP growth rates. And why is that? South Africa has a very high unemployment rate. And given the projection that we have for next year, we still expect South Africa's unemployment rate to remain at above that of 30%. In the 30% unemployment rate. At a 5% growth rate, maintain that over the next 10 years, that means that 30% level declines to near 10%. In fact, this is something that South Africa could have achieved. Had we maintained the same growth levels seen under that of Thabo Mbeki, the country currently would have had an unemployment rate close to that about 10%, and roughly about 6 million people employed today, 6 million more people employed today compared to that of about 8.7 million thereabouts. This is a difference of about 23 million people employed compared to 8.7 million people employed. But the living conditions marker, if you're looking at that of GDP per capita, which is the share which is the size of the South African economy divided by its population, that would have been almost double than where it currently is currently. So you're essentially looking at the average South African being almost twice as rich as where they currently are. So that's the importance of these numbers, is that they actually have real consequences for ordinary South Africans as well as that for ordinary businesses. And in order for South Africa to achieve that success very easily, it takes measures in terms of improving South Africa's electricity generation, which we don't think the 2025 RRP plan will do so. I think it's quite a complicated plan, which France has also clearly laid out on this show, and that actually refitting coal defunct stations in the country, which currently are there in South Africa and can be refitted in a short space of time quite cheaply, as well as an aggressive move to remove policies that acts as a tax on capital investment in the country, you could see those high GDP growth rates.
Yeah, thank you so much there, Becky. I think given that we're kind of running a little bit short on time, I'm going to have to move us on to the next topic. But I think it fits in very well with what you've been talking about there, because you know, we're looking at moderate improvement with the possibility of incredible improvement in South Africa, and so really that is something that we should be thankful for. And specifically, I think some people in South Africa are incredibly not going to name names or mention anyone, but some people are incredibly thankful for the fact that interest rates have fallen, which means that paying off the debt on your credit card loans is suddenly easier. Um, so, but we're going to stay on the kind of gratitude train, because Richard, you've been in America for quite a number of years more than Becky, and so you've decided that this holiday is worth pointing out. And so, can you tell us what you are thankful for in the world today, and maybe also just for the South Africans at home? Can you tell us what the hell a Thanksgiving even is?
Okay. Yeah. So tomorrow is Thanksgiving, which is this most American of holidays. It goes back to the 1600s when the Pilgrims at harvest time, I guess is around now, had a feast with the Native Americans, with the American Indian tribes that helped them, and it's become a staple of the calendar. It's always the last Thursday in November, and it's a wonderful holiday. People stop at mostly you get Friday off as well. It's always on a Thursday. And it's a time to stop and reflect and be thankful for the many benefits that we have. And Canada has its own Thanksgiving as well, but I think it's a few weeks before ours here. And yeah, I love it because it does make you stop, and often at Thanksgiving lunches or dinners, people go around the table and say what they're thankful for. And we've had some bad news, like especially from Simon. Maybe Britain needs a bit more bad news. But if you take a step back and look at the progress that humanity has made over the last just few years, 20 years, 30 years, this century, we're an awful lot better off. We live longer lives. We have more access to things. We have water that's clean to drink, more and more available. We have vaccines that keep us safe, incredible advances in medicine. We have things like the internet. That means that I can talk to you all over the world, and it's an amazing advance. This brings us closer together. So I wrote this little piece that's up on the Common Sense website about why we should be grateful, and the number of indicators that show that life for humanity is improving, and not just that, but also for the environment. Our environment is becoming cleaner and better. And it's probably a little outre to plug your own piece on the Common Sense. It's probably a little arsey of me to use the word outre, but there you go. But I'm not even sure what it means. But there you go. I want to plug not myself or my own piece, but a website called humanprogress.org, which is run by my good friend Marion Tupi, who started it. And if you're feeling depressed, go to humanprogress.org and just have a look at the reams, the huge database they have there of indicators on almost everything that shows how, thanks to a combination of of markets, of rewarding innovators, and having a free speech and the ability of people to share ideas and to invest in new ideas, the world is getting better. And so even though things can sometimes seem a bit depressing, and if you pick up the paper, as they say, if it bleeds, it leads. Newspapers and the media are filled with bad news stories because that's what happens. But absent are all the good news, little stories that trickle along every single day, small advances that add up to our lives becoming much wealthier. And I just as a quick aside, I can remember when I was about 15, 14, having lunch with my grandmother and a friend of hers who he was an engineer and a very interesting guy who he was a pilot during the Second World War. And I think I was lamenting something about acid rain or something, whatever was the environmental topic of the day, and them just slapping me about and telling me how ridiculous I was being and how grateful I should be, and then describing the pea soup fogs in London where the pollution was so bad that you had to walk in front of a car to guide the car along. You had to feel your way along buildings because that's how polluted the cities were. And so if you are feeling depressed, go and find an elderly person, go and find your grandmother or somebody and ask them what life was really like in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, and then just be grateful for the incredible wealth that we enjoy now.
Vicky, to you?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add there, so I've been here in California for nearly 2 years now. And one of the most remarkable things, just speaking on that human progress that Richard has mentioned there, is that the first thing I noticed is how many old people there are here in California, which was quite amazing. It's not to say that people in South Africa don't live quite long lives, but I believe the life expectancy in South Africa is about 67, and here in America is about 75, close to 80. So it's quite remarkable the progress that has been made here in America, but not only that, but also the progress in South Africa as well. I can remember a time, for example, when I was young, this would be about 2004 and 2005 thereabout, where for the first time in the Eastern Cape, which is where I was raised, there was electrification. And for someone like my grandmother, she went from making fires at night in order for us to have warm meals at night into having a stove and an oven. And for her daughters to have jobs, which could then have an income in order for me to go to good schools that I could therefore qualify to be here in California and doing my master's in economics. So even it's those are the things that I'm grateful for, and I believe as well that other South Africans as well are grateful for, and I wish that other millions of more South Africans also gain those opportunities as well.
Sorry, I was just about to say, if something went wrong briefly there, that I celebrate Thanksgiving every year, and I have done for the last decade by virtue of my marriage to an American. And I think it's a wonderful moment, and I think that it does prompt a huge amount of patriotism in the sense that it's a fixture, but also because I think being thankful is an encompassing feature about where you, how you see your own life and the things that have helped you and the people, and I don't mean to be deliberately despondent about the UK. Unfortunately, I think that we're giving South Africans the truth and giving them the truth which they make, informed decisions apart in the future. But I love Thanksgiving as a feature, as a yearly fixture, and I think it's a really important thing. And we've got our own thing. What do we got? Heritage Day, where we have braais. I think in 50 years' time, we're going to look back upon that as our own Thanksgiving, and people in suburbs getting together, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I, for one, am certainly thankful for the fact that we live in a world in which we can have the opportunity to do this. That, that not only is the technology there that for us to facilitate these discussions and to then publish them online and to have that done in front of an audience, but that the kind of temperature, the ideological temperature is such that we can have conversations about topics that if you used to hold opinions much like ours maybe 5-10 years ago, you would be lambasted and called all types of names, and the reception that the general reception of the Common Sense has been nothing but warm and enthusiastic praise for everything apart from my mustache, which is why it had to go going into this episode. Sorry to men's mental health.
Yes,
But I
because your
think
wife to be has good taste. There you go.
exactly. That is exactly the reason why. And I will, unfortunately, the ladies and gentlemen, it was not Richard's incessant bullying, although that did certainly contribute a little bit. But I guess that's my comeuppance. Um, so that feels like a great place to leave it, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much to everyone for tuning in to this week's episode, and thank you so much to the panel for your contributions. And come back again next week for another episode of South Africa's Best News Podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.